Chuck, it's great to see you today.
Hi, Jason. Great to see you.
Chuck, you've been following the war very closely since it first began, and you yourself were formerly a Navy SEAL Team 6 squadron leader. But what have you seen recently? Russia had said that they want to have a ceasefire over Easter. Did that work out?
It didn't work out if you were a Vatnik. Russia, although when they announced the ceasefire, they said that they were standing by for Ukrainian provocations. Well, those provocations turned into approximately 46 incidents of major combat initiated by the Russians for every day of the ceasefire. So in non-war college talk, that means the Russians violated the ceasefire in almost every operational area there is and staged multiple attacks over the space of the truce weekend. There were a couple of reasons why they might have wanted to do that. One of them is that there were at least 2 or 3 major Russian defeats leading up to the ceasefire. In one particular operation, and again, I'm understating these losses, they lost more than a battalion of armor. Wait for it, 8 battalions of artillery and hundreds of armored vehicles of a number so big that it doesn't really correspond to a battalion or regiment or a brigade. And on the day of these particular losses, for the battalion-sized losses of armor, they only lost 1,500 casualties. That's not the biggest single day of casualties they've ever had, but this was the most staggering number of material losses that I can recall since the battles of Vuhledar 1 and 2. So a bad day for the Russians.
So, aside from this very successful ceasefire, per se, how has everything else been going for the Russians? It doesn't seem like, despite a lot of negative news that we hear, they're making a lot of great successes or gains. What are you seeing?
Well, they're flailing about to try to change their tactics. I think we've all seen the donkeys and the civilian vehicles being used for logistics. They've got an endemic and uncurable logistical problem. They have blown through all their vehicles, their trucks. They have wiped out their entire logistical service corps by sending guys to the front with bayonets. So that problem is literally the elephant in the room for them tactically. But they've taken to now using any sort of fast-moving vehicle they can lay their hands on. Motorcycles, wait for it, electric scooters, anything that they can get to. And their latest tactic is to flood the zone with 100 motorcyclists and come up behind them with armored vehicles and tanks. They're taking a page out of the Army Ranger airport seizure handbook. A C-130 will land, and out of the back come dozens of Rangers on dirt bikes, and they spread out all over the field. I bring up the Ranger airfield tactics because those are done at night, and that's why they work. Now, to our listening guests, they know the Russians don't operate at night. They cannot. Their troops are not well trained. They don't have fundamental soldiering skills, and they don't have night vision. They don't have thermal rifle scopes, etc. So although they're making some occasional progress with this flood the zone on motorcycles, it's done in the morning. It's done basically, they attack at the crack of 11 a.m. The Ukrainians are always waiting for them, and their casualties are enormous. But again, Russia doesn't care how many people it kills. So this is something that is continuing on, but we see Russia perhaps realizing that the materiel costs, at least, are too high, and they're trying to solve it with tactical innovations.
So, what sort of tactical innovations are the Russians going for? And how have you seen this evolve during the course of the war?
Well, one of the big problems here for the Russians, and frankly, it's going to be for any army in the world going forward, and that is, how do you maneuver across open space in a 21st century battlefield? And the Russians are dealing with this problem. In World War Two, it was the M1 carbine that killed the most people, the little short version of the M1. 3 years ago, the weapon that kills the most people on the battlefield doesn't exist. The first-person drone is what kills more Russian soldiers than any other weapon, not artillery, not rifle fire, not snipers, not mines. It's the first-person drone. So the Russians are facing this problem. How do they go across these open fields? And anyone who's looked at a topographic map of Ukraine, you can see the windbreaks, the tree lines that circumscribe their agricultural fields. That's literally like the ants going on the picnic. Everything, Ukrainian and Russian, tries to move within those tree lines. Now, a lot of times, because the wind in the northern hemisphere blows west to east, these lines are perpendicular to the Russian vector of advance. So the Russians have to go from tree line to tree line. So they've tried electric scooters, they're trying dirt bikes, they're trying everything they can. Two things. You're in the open, you got a dirt bike, you're riding across a furrowed field, you can probably go 40 miles an hour, the drone can go 60. It's going to get you. The other thing is, it's not just a field full of pumpkins, it's full of landmines. And we have all seen a guy who thought he was riding a dirt bike, but he winds up flying to Chicago. So the Russians are trying to evolve their tactics. I will say nothing in favor of the Russian army. They are bloody amateurs, but I will say this. NATO needs to look closely at this battle problem because there are two of the most experienced combat armies right now in 21st century warfare. Number one is Ukraine. And number two, lagging behind and with a black eye, is Russia. And these are problems that NATO has to look at, because if NATO were fighting Ukraine, they wouldn't be doing so well either.
So that brings up a great point. NATO and all the countries in NATO invest tons of money for a form of warfare that seems sort of obsolete in many ways. Then increasingly, it's something like drones, where all of a sudden, for years and years, armed personnel carriers were a priority, as were tanks and things like this. But if you're using drones, that can sort of change the calculus of how warfare is done. How do you think that'll affect all of NATO strategy as a whole, but also the future of warfare and the technology used in it?
Well, we're looking right now, as highly effective as first-person drone is, and it is incredibly effective. This is going to be looked at 50 years looking back. These are going to be like the sop with camels, because the drones now essentially, this isn't entirely true, but they are essentially one operator, one drone. Now, one operator can control a number of sorties, missions, different drones a day, maybe 5, 10, 15. I've heard of a single operator flying 20 missions in a day. We're going to see the executive function of that commander, that kid with the controller. It's going to be AI delegated. So these drones are going to be released, and they are going to have their algorithms, and they search for something rectilinear, something that looks like this, something, and they're going to vector the attacks by themselves. That's the intermediate step, okay? So that's, World War II and the Spitfire. Very quickly, because this stuff is going to happen, on a logarithmic scale, on an exponential scale. Within 2 or 3 years, you're going to see drone swarms interacting with each other in the manner that brimstone missiles can do now. You squirt 3 brimstone missiles at a target, one can go high, come out of the sun, one can attack from the rear, and one can attack from the front. So we're going to see that. And in fact, unfortunately, I'm still calling this war at least 24 more months, probably 36. And we'll see true interactive, drone swarms in this war.
That's pretty amazing. So within this very war, you think we will actually see that advancement of technology? One thing is to see it right now, how many improvements or changes have happened just in 3 years. But just imagine, as this war is allowed, not only Ukraine and Russia, but also those working with both countries, to see the advances in technology and to try out new things, to gather data, huge amounts of data of what's worked, what's not worked, and to figure out better ways of doing it. It certainly have an impact. So what other changes do you think we'll see during the life of this war? And why do you think it'll be still another 2 years before this war will end?
I think one of the reasons this war is going to go on, the reason it's gone on as long as it has now, is the West isn't paying attention. Uh, the United States is paying attention, but not necessarily in a good way. You and I talked a couple of weeks ago, and we both predicted that Washington would become frustrated in that whatever they asked of Moscow, or whatever they thought Moscow had agreed to, or whatever progress they thought they had made talking to the Kremlin, that wasn't going to show up on the battlefield. Russia was not going to reduce its attacks. It was not going to reduce attacks on civilian housing. It was not going to retard or slow down its attacks in the East. And I think we've seen a lot of frustration out of Washington now, with Washington even saying they were going to kick over the table and go home. That might not necessarily be a bad thing at this point. When you have, we're going to talk in just a minute about your survey of Russian media, but some of the things that you were reading and telling to me earlier, it doesn't sound like we're not hearing the kind of noises out of Moscow that maybe you and I would want to hear.
No, certainly the case. The Russian news in recent times has been quite positive about what Washington is doing. The fact that Washington is continuously putting pressure on Kyiv, that Washington is threatening to cut off supplies to Ukraine, that the United States has continued to take a position that even the Russians view to be adversarial to Ukraine. And that's probably not something we want to see. More than that, the fact that every time Washington comes out with a leak or a statement, or it's a major news story saying that the U.S. may recognize the occupied territories as part of Russia, it becomes a major positive news story in Russia, which they say that finally somebody has arrived in Washington who understands the perspective of what we are trying to do. I would not argue that's probably a good sign when one of our largest adversaries is saying that we're on the right track doing what we should be doing, including trying to make sure that Ukraine would never enter NATO. These are all things that have been commented on just in the past couple of days by senior Russian officials and became major news articles in the largest news publications in Russia. Overall, Moscow could not be happier with Washington at this moment. And that's something that certainly probably bodes poorly for U.S. national security. And it's probably another strong signal to Europe of why they need to put their own house in order and make sure they can provide for their own national security. Because the Americans, it seems, cannot be counted on. But what do you see?
Well, I see the same thing. And I think there is, previously in Washington, we had a misapprehension about Russia's willingness to start a strategic thermonuclear war when we're talking about a country that has no strategic targets. This just wasn't going to happen. Now there seems to be a misapprehension in Washington about what exactly the relationship is between Russia vis-a-vis the United States. Look, for Russians, you and I know this, having been in the business, we are the perennial adversary. Their term, not mine. They are not out to do anything that comports with U.S. foreign policy or to the benefit of their European neighbors. They absolutely are not. I'm literally left to wonder. You talk about acknowledging Russian territorial conquest of its neighbor. What are they going to do? Russia has proclaimed Kherson now and forever part of Russia, but they don't control all of Kherson. The same with Zaporizhzhia. They don't control all of Zaporizhzhia. Donetsk, Luhansk, all of these places Russia has said are now forever part of Russia. They haven't shown it on the ground. So why the United States would come in and dictate internal politics to Ukraine is unbelievable. But, you and I were speaking before we went on, it may not be the worst thing in the world that this regime in Washington decides to get out of the peace negotiation business with Russia. But I'd remind everybody, Washington is going to kick over the table in frustration. It's something you and I said was going to happen. Russia is not going to play ball with anybody.
It's sort of absurd to begin with. that the United States decided to interject itself as the peace negotiator in this process. Neither Russia nor Ukraine requested that. For that matter, the allies of the United States, Europe, were excluded from the process, which becomes even more absurd when you consider. Let's imagine that a peace deal had been found, and the Russians and Ukrainians agreed to some sort of a ceasefire. But who would be the one to enforce that? The United States have been very clear that it would not be the one to enforce that. So that means realistically, it'd fall on the Europeans. But how then was Washington negotiating with Moscow and with Kyiv if it doesn't include the Europeans to make sure that they agree with the terms and the conditions of the agreement? Like any other contract or any other agreement, without enforceability, it means very little. And yet the Washington was unwilling to discuss what would happen if Russia broke the ceasefire. What would happen if Russia was unwilling to maintain the rules that it said it agreed to? Now, keep in mind, I think we've all seen that Russia violates international law and international agreements day and night. It's regular for them. It's normal. So if that's the case, we can assume it would happen in this case as well. But if there's no repercussions, why would Russia possibly stop? Who would be the ones there guarding between the Ukrainian territory and the Russian territory? If there's nobody there, why would Russia possibly not just go full out in the near term and try to take more of Ukrainian territory? Of course, they'd find a pretext or way to justify it. But the way that Washington's been behaving, it's quite possible that Washington would accept that pretext and do nothing to stop it. So I would argue that Ukraine is absolutely in the right to not agree to the absurd terms and conditions set for them by Washington. And more than that, that they right now are treating very suspiciously what Washington wishes to do, something that Russia seems very happy with. So going ahead, though, I agree totally. Washington right now is frustrated. It does not see the success that it thought it would find. It thought that this would be something where the new U.S. president would just be able to force through a forged peace. But we see that's simply not going to happen. And now they're losing interest. But that is just the reason why they should probably get out of the way. Why are they possibly still on the scene trying to dictate what peace should be like if they're not going to be the ones to either assist Ukraine or the ones to being able to enforce the agreement? If they don't want to be involved, all the better. Don't be involved. Just get off the stage because they're certainly not making anything better for Ukraine, for Europe, or for anyone else for that matter. But perhaps Moscow does see positives as we see reported daily in the Russian news. What do you think?
Well, I'm wondering what Washington thought it could achieve here, right? You don't have a reliable dialogue partner in Russia. You know, bear in mind, Lavrov told Liz Truss 12 hours before the invasion that there wasn't going to be an invasion. I mean, okay, that's how we start. Are you going to negotiate with Lavrov? Here's the other thing. Why should Ukraine accede to any of these agreements from negotiations from which it was excluded? It wasn't part of the Saudi Arabian dialogues. God knows what arrangements were made there. Again, it's a bit chaotic of Washington to literally think they're going to go in there. This was never going to be a real estate deal. It just was not. Europe and the United States, but principally the United States, has tried everything to solve this war except the one thing that will solve this war: defeat the Russian army in the field. Give Ukraine the tools that it needs to beat back the Russian aggressor. No one has tried that yet. Why don't we try that for 10 months and see how it works? But in the meantime, I'd still say this. Look, the war goes up, it goes down. I'm a long war guy. I wish I was short on the war. I'm not. But I haven't changed this opinion one iota. Russia is losing this war, and it will never win it, full stop. Now, how much Ukraine bleeds in the meantime is something that I'm concerned about. But Russia can't win this war. Luckily for us, they are guided by a megalomaniacal, self-appointed military genius who has a military staff of buffoons. And they're willing to fight to the last Vatnik. However, it's Ukraine that is suffering, but Russia can't win this, and they know that they can't, or they're about to figure it out, I think.
So let me ask you to follow up on that. Why is it that Russia can't win this war? Why is it that you think that Russia, despite its massive size, will fail to be able to conquer Ukraine?
Well, one of the things that exists, and we saw this in before the beginnings of the Battle of Bakhmut, Russia went into this black hole in terms of training. About the time of Bakhmut, we saw that the time between a Russian volunteering in Moscow, that means getting dragged out by his long hair from the subway and put onto a bus, 8 days later, he wound up in Ukraine. Some of these people reported they had never fired their rifle, let alone sighted in, let alone gotten marksmanship training, learned some land navigation, even learning how to march. And these people found themselves in battle where they died in their tens of thousands. And they're still dying. Russia is, by some estimates, President Zelensky thinks the Russian casualties are over 1 million. Even the most conservative estimates are putting Russia at 300,000 to 400,000 dead and about 1.2 million total casualties. Why don't I think they can win this? Because they can't train their soldiers. These guys aren't soldiers, they're civilians with rifles. Their military leadership is pathetic. They cannot conduct a night attack. They can't get an attack off the ground before 10:30 in the morning. You can't win a war like that. You just can't. And we've also got this incident where Russia isn't really good at coordinating its precision strike munitions with its frontline objectives. And why would they be? Their goal is to terrorize and kill the Ukrainian population. So more than 90% of their precision strike munitions are aimed at apartment buildings, cathedrals, bomb shelters. And the McDonald's in Kyiv, as you know, has been hit, 7 times? It's literally a target. That's one of the reasons why they're not going to win this war.
So if that's the case, how does the war end for Russia?
If I were, in a higher echelon, so I will say, because I'm not, my opinion doesn't mean very much. But for me, the strategic goal of Ukraine needs to be defeating the Russian military. Take the cudgel out of Putin's hand, right? He's already pretty much got a wet noodle instead of a blackjack. You see these attacks failing. You see them lose 25, 30, 40 tanks in a day, 80 pieces of artillery. These are routine losses. They're sending T-50 tanks. I mean, Elvis would find the T-50 tank was an antique. But Ukraine's security is going to depend on having a deterrent and more superior military force than Russia can bring to it. That's the path to Ukraine's sovereignty and security and political stability and economic stability. So Russia's got to be put in the box militarily. And again, the one thing that NATO and the United States has not tried, arm Ukraine with the tools it needs to win the job. And I'll conceptualize it this way. The United States Army, if it were on the ground in Ukraine, would be doing worse than Ukraine. The United States Army can't fight without air superiority. They can't fight without artillery dominance. They can't fight without sufficient logistics to conduct large-scale ground maneuver warfare. We've denied Ukraine everything it needs to do that, but they're still fighting on, and frankly, they're still kicking ass.
That's great. And listen, looking forward to Russia's defeat is something that I'm sure that everybody listening is looking forward to. Chuck, so great talking to you.
Thanks again.